PhD in Progress, Episode 14. This week I talked to Parag Gupta, a 12th year graduate student at Northwestern University. We discuss his grad student journey and how to learn from mistakes while maintaining a positive outlook. Let's go!
That's what I hope that we can do.
All right, so let's start. Welcome back to the PhD in Progress podcast, where we talk about your education, your career, and your life. I'm Jason, and today I am joined here with Parag Gupta. Say hi.
Hello, guys.
All right, and Parag is finishing up his PhD at Northwestern University in mechanical engineering. Is that correct?
Mechanical engineering is where I formally sit. My advisor is in material science and engineering, and I'm also co-advised by some individuals at Argonne National Lab.
All right, so simple. Very nice and clean and simple, much
Very
like
clean.
The whole of your PhD career so far. So
yeah, exactly. Good descriptor.
So I wanted to have Parag on the podcast because I saw a TED Talk from him probably a few months ago, I guess in April or so, and he was discussing his journey through his 12 years of graduate school, and maybe we can talk about that for the duration of this. I figured he gained so much knowledge, and when I was talking to him, we talked on the phone for a bit yesterday, and just the positivity that came through on that conversation yesterday and his TED Talk in general were kind of amazing. Because I know I go through a week of just having bad experimentation and just hate grad school a little bit.
Sure.
I can't imagine like a year of just plodding through things that aren't working. And I guess we're going to hear about your journey.
Sure. I think that happens. That specific thing that you're talking about in terms of data acquisition happens to every PhD student, more or less. It's just a matter of how you redefine the problem and the statements that you want to come to as conclusions. So what I would kind of hope that is communicated to the people that are listening is that everyone's path is kind of unique. I mean, no two PhDs are the same. They're also not the same in time or quality, for that matter. And what the true intent of a PhD should be, in my opinion, is to really learn the subject and contribute to a fundamental base of knowledge that did not exist in the past. And I think what ends up happening in this day and age, especially in the United States with our university structure being more business-like than it used to be, is that people come into graduate school with a different notion of what it is that they want to accomplish. And that has changed and shifted over the last few decades in academia. And I think that that's a struggle that people have. And what I would hope to see happen, or at least revisit more often than it's done, is that we have students come in that don't just try and get the last three letters behind their name, but really are trying to investigate what it is that they are chosen to investigate or like to investigate because they have a true passion for that science and true passion for education.
And see, that's the kind of philosophy we're going to get, and it's awesome, I think. I think I really enjoy talking about the higher level, as any PhD candidate probably does, thinking of the concepts behind the fundamentals, right?
Sure.
And so today on the show, we're going to go through maybe your background a bit, talk about your 12 years in grad school.
Sure.
We'll try to motivate the listeners a bit because, like I said before, you're kind of a motivational speaker in a way, I think.
I think that's what the person overseeing me at Argonne, his name is Dr. Robert A. Irk, he said that to me after I spoke with him about whether or not he had seen the talk, and he said, "I think you might make a good motivational speaker."
Yeah.
So that's a very nice compliment, I think.
A new audience for you. I'm excited to share. And lastly, sure, we'll go over the advice as we asked to all our guests. We'll go over the advice to second or third year self. You, Parag, as I guess 10 years ago,
right?
What you would have told yourself to improve or inspire yourself. Okay.
I think that's a fantastic starting point almost. And the real key elements that I would tell myself is to never be scared to ask for help. This was something that I didn't really realize had a lot of value. I think the second thing is to make sure that you know, to re-look at what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And again, that will be based on the fundamental premise of doing a PhD. And the third thing, I guess, would be to be a little bit less naive about this idealistic manner, in which I was approaching everything. I think that had to do a lot with what I was doing at the time, which was living out of my CV, my resume. And you know, what ended up really being a detraction for me was my prior accomplishments. So I think that may be a good place to start in terms of the scope of this conversation that we're having today. If you'd like me to start there, I think it might give the listeners a better understanding of what it was that I was facing as my primary challenge.
Sure. Yeah, let's go for it then.
So it's going to be a little bit obnoxious in the very beginning because I'm going to lay myself out as this person that is not very humble, and that was actually very true. At the age of 15 until I was 22, I was very highly accomplished in the academic world. I was the valedictorian of my high school down in Mississippi, and I attended Vanderbilt University on a full merit scholarship. I would not have gone to the university otherwise. It was obscenely expensive in 1998, but it's even more expensive now.
I can only imagine.
And I definitely needed that support. And I was magnificently good at going into the classroom, taking exams, filling out perfect problem sets, and submitting those things without any errors. And so I had this false impression that I was really fundamentally learning the subject matter very well. But in fact, what I was doing is going through the motions. I was just doing what was on the surface indicative of learning the subject matter at hand, when in actuality, I was just doing what I needed to do to be at the top of my class.
And I mean, that kind of makes sense because that's what early education is trained on, or, you know,
Sure.
that's what it's based on. You know, you learn some facts and you're able to spit them out again or put them in essay form, and that's it.
And at the same time, one might think that my public school upbringing in Mississippi was a negative, but I posit that I probably had one of the strongest public educations of anyone in this country, because the specific school district that I attended was very, very high level. And some people kind of scoff at that, thinking that that's not really possible in the state of Mississippi. But in fact, I went to one of the best public school systems I've ever seen in its organization, in terms of its teacher capabilities and whatnot. So all of these things led into me having this overconfidence in the way that I approached my life. And because I was so highly accomplished at Vanderbilt and continued this high level of performance in the classrooms, and also represented the university at the Rhodes Scholarship competition, and had a lot of deans and chancellors and provosts that kind of looked at me saying, "Oh, he's the golden boy." Yeah. He's the golden boy, right? So in graduate school, you have the golden boy of a lab. I was kind of the golden boy for the Department of Mechanical Engineering to a certain extent. I mean, there are, of course, very accomplished students there in addition to me.
Were you like a PhD comics character? Or
I was. I mean, even at that point, and for those that don't know, PhD Comics is a comic written by George Cham, who during his PhD tenure at Stanford University started writing a comic about the trials and tribulations of PhD students. And so I was very much like the unnamed character in his comic strip that kind of didn't really know exactly how to proceed from there, but knew that he wanted to enroll in something that would provide a certain amount of prestige that was aligned with what I had already accomplished, right? So fundamentally, I was trying to do the next step to show people that I'm capable of doing that next step, and that I deserve to be recognized for the efforts done in trying to obtain that higher degree, whereas my heart was really not in learning the subject matter. And this was one of the biggest problems I had as an early in my early 20s.
And so did you not know where your heart was interested in, or was it just that, you did so well in school and you felt like you should be the best in school to shrink it down?
So there's an element of both of those. I definitely wanted to be the best because I'd always been the best. I had often heard that, you're the best in your hometown, but when you go to Vanderbilt, you're going to be one of the crowd. And really, that wasn't the case for me. I still was able to excel at that level. And so that further led into this like false sense of confidence that was represented on paper by all of my accomplishments. The real crux of the matter is that even though I had this opinion, I still definitely was interested in the subject matter, right? I still wanted to be a PhD recipient in engineering because I had a special love and affinity for mechanical engineering, which is my subfield of interest, and I always wanted to study that in relation to its material science and engineering applications.
And so in that vein, before we move on, were you interested in becoming a professor, or did you just want to bring this to industry? Just so we...
Sure. I mean, at that point, the naive 21-year-old, after having just done an internship at Lehman Brothers as well, was kind of money-minded, right? Like, how quickly can I parlay this degree into my doctorate? Which at that point I thought, 3 years maximum. There's no way I'm going further than 3 years in my doctorate, which is perhaps the most naive thing that I could have ever said to myself at that time. But, it was a very money-minded, driven decision-making process, or it was more of a money-minded decision than it should have been. Of course, the professorial type of position always played a role because, again, there's prestige and acclaim in being a professor at Vanderbilt. There's a prestige and acclaim in being a professor at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, or Northwestern or Harvard or any of these tier one institutions that are fantastic. Because if you're at a tier one research institution and you somehow manage to get tenure, which is also very difficult, then you're one of the most brilliant people in that field in the world. And that's pretty much an undisputed...
That's the equivalent to like a CEO of a huge company or the best heart surgeon in the world, right? It's something like that.
Maybe not so big. Maybe the best heart surgeon in the state of Illinois or the best, you know what I mean? Yeah. But exactly. It's all relative, and it very much doesn't matter because you can make your own path. There are Nobel laureates from every university, whether it be, even the University of Kentucky, places that you wouldn't necessarily attribute. And now I'm going to get a phone call.
Seriously.
Kentucky. No, I find that to be an excellent institution. My point is that at any institution of higher education, you'll find brilliance, right? And so it doesn't really matter as long as the place where you are is noted for the research that you're conducting. And so it's not so cut and dry, right? One need not be at MIT, for example, to be recognized as the best in the field.
Yeah, so would you say that your lack of passion then ended up in some kind of unfocus when you started grad school?
100%. So okay. When I came, I was actually recruited very highly for graduate school. I still did the normal application cycle as one might do, but I was kind of screened out in many ways by a lot of professors at different institutions, and they approached me by giving me counter offers, which is very kind of unnatural. And I found this out to be true after the fact, and it was probably because, of course I was good on paper, but I also managed to obtain a master's degree and a undergraduate degree all within 4 years. So from a potential advisor's perspective, this looks like a student that's very dedicated towards doing whatever research project is presented to him and then moving forward in bringing a claim to the subject matter. So,
but in your mind, was it like also being in those earlier steps of school where you're just finishing this assignment and doing it well?
Exactly
it?
Like that. Right. So when you go into graduate school, and I recommend that everybody that's considering graduate school not consider the institution from which they have their undergraduate. There's other reasons for that. It's called an incestual degree path, which basically means that you haven't been given enough experience in academia from different points of view. So actually at that time, I knew that graduate school would be much different in terms of the structure of the PhD, not having coursework after a certain point in time. It's all research. It's all very self-motivated. But I never wanted to approach it that way. And my advisor, who was a brilliant computational mechanist at the time, his name is Wing-Kam Liu, was very hands-off, and because that's the way that he felt that he should have approached the educational process for PhD students. And in retrospect, this was a brilliant way to do it. And I didn't realize, it's brilliant in the sense that the amount of flexibility given to a PhD student should naturally be higher than what I thought it should have been. Does that make sense?
I think so.
And I really have a lot of respect for him as an individual, even though I moved on to a different path 2.5 years after being in his lab. I still have the utmost respect for all of the people associated with my degree, but especially him, because he taught me at the very beginning, or it took me some time, but he taught me how it was that I needed to be a student, what was actually lacking in me that I needed to take to the next level. And for somebody that always got a yes in his life, I never was given a no in anything academically related at all until I was 25. And I had this hurdle with not wanting to do computation.
It's funny how that challenge is needed, I think, in order to put your frame of view into a good frame of view, a good point of view, right? To understand yourself better, you need to be challenged in any way. And if you haven't had that, then you're kind of floating and just plodding along, but you might be going down the wrong road.
Sure. And this is no negative comment on Vanderbilt University. They educated me properly. It's that nobody would ever know that this is a problem that I was encountering, because there's no evidence of that kind of before the fact that you can use to apply by saying, you know what, this guy might not be all that he's intimating of himself. And I think that became very evident because one must be prepared to study at that level, and I just wasn't prepared. And I was living in yesterday. I was living out of my prior accomplishments. At the core of my being, I thought that if I spend enough time doing this PhD, at some point they'll just award me the degree out of, almost, these are the types of ridiculous thoughts that enter a lot of people's minds. And even without doing any dedicated work, I would think that I somehow was under the misconception that one day, out of the blue, they'll be like, okay, well, you've been here long enough.
Yeah, and
here's a PhD for your trouble.
it kind of goes to the entitlement mentality, right? Where, I don't feel qualified to talk about any of this, which might play into imposter syndrome, which I hope we talk about later.
Yes,
but
I've got that noted here as a subject.
But of course, on that, I've totally forgot what I was talking about.
Don't worry, it happens to me all the time. I'm very long-winded.
Perfect.
But again, what I was trying to touch upon here is that the advisor's role and the way that I interacted with this very, very famous and very, very brilliant professor is in no way something that I look back upon and have negative impression of. Every interaction I had with him in retrospect was a very good one, and it was meant with purity, and it was approached by him as very much a professor-student relationship in which I had the failing, in which I was not at the level that I perhaps should have been, even mentally.
Maybe it was just that you were learning. You're a student. You should
True.
have been.
There's value in that, and one of the things that I can say is that even at that point, I didn't recognize the need, or I didn't recognize how it was that I should ask the questions that I wanted the answers to, if that makes sense.
So what kind of? What questions?
The reality is that I didn't know how to do research at all.
I see.
I would read literature reviews. I would read about what the other students in my group were doing, but I wasn't able to translate that into an action item. And when you have a situation where one professor's method of approaching his advising is a little bit more behind the scenes, where he's waiting for the student to initiate the production of the questions, it just never became clear to me what it was that I should ask.
Yeah,
it was very difficult.
I definitely had a similar experience in my first couple of years of grad school too, where I had the trouble figuring out the question I should ask and translating into the experiment that I should be doing.
Right.
And my boss is also similarly hands-off, and she's great. I love her as a boss, and it was just, my not understanding the style of what I need to be learning at that point.
So let me just follow this up by saying it's not as if after the first 3 years I had this massive epiphany and I started asking the right questions. I still to this day have trouble with refining elements of the scope as a function of smaller components of the work. And that, I think, is something that's just a part of research. I think that that's something that just goes hand in hand with the path that one takes in academia.
Okay, so I guess getting to the big question, why 12 years? Why?
Right. So that's
what everyone asks you, I'm sure.
Everybody asks me all the time. And honestly, there's not a person on the face of the planet that thinks about, not a PhD student on the face of the planet, that thinks about the amount of time that he's been there other than the person to whom the question is being posed. So it's not as if somebody will ask you, so 12 years, don't you think you should graduate? And the person listening to this question is all of a sudden going to have this great epiphany and be like, oh my gosh, you're so right. I should start writing now. Or, I mean, the student, in my case, I think about graduating every 5 to 7 minutes. It's a ridiculous frequency. Because,
I'm with you right now.
Yeah, I mean, and this is not just because I'm in the middle of composing my dissertation and acquiring the last little bit of data. This is something that I've been tackling for years. And not only that, also writing. I do a lot of mental writing. And so a lot of the problem behind my length of time was this non-dedication to the actual science. And I left my group, or I left that original advisor in 2005. Very nice mutual parting of ways, because I wanted to study experimental mechanics as opposed to computational mechanics. And what I realized was that I was doing a lot of acting without thinking, or a lot of thinking without acting. And both of those are extremely bad ways to go about approaching science. And so even though I had another path laid out by approaching a secondary advisor with whom I had had some background experience and establishing a path at Argonne National Laboratory, I still had the fundamental problems composing the questions and knowing how to approach the research. Because, again, I was doing a lot of thinking without following up on it, or I was doing a lot of initial investigations without doing a full one.
Exactly. And so there's like always 3 pieces to your work. You need to part 1, think or plan or strategize, whatever that is, right? You need to part 2, start, and part 3, arguably the most important, finish.
Well, yeah, right. So there's a component. There's a component in between start and finish, and it's very much an iterative cycle, because you might end up back at start. But the point is that you must start in order to get back to start. And many times I didn't want to start because I knew that there would have to be an iteration which puts me back at start, and I wanted to preempt or prevent that from necessarily occurring by trying to rationalize every possible parameter that could influence my tests. A priori. It's called before the fact, right? And this is, again, a very, very bad way of doing research. But on the research side of the equation was this problem, this Parag that was trying to develop into a student that was approaching his PhD with seriousness, with a dedication to the science, but then also because of his naivety is now in a position where he had to resign a National Science Foundation fellowship and find an individualized path for funding. This became especially complicated because I switched out of computational mechanics to go into experimental mechanics, and going that way is very bad because you need money for users' fees, you need research equipment costs, you need supporting collaboration, you need perhaps an extra pair of hands many times. And
so
in computation,
just in the sentence, because I'm not super familiar with how engineering school
sure.
works in general. So what's the big difference between the two, the computational and experimental that you're saying?
Right. So in the computational world, theoretically, you only need a computer and very large servers, because what you're doing is you're coming up with theory and equations, and then you're creating models. You're creating simulations that try and mimic behavior that is observed in real phenomena.
I see. In experimental, you're building machines and doing, testing whatever parameters are in the real world.
Right. It's like the difference between using a CAD drawing and creating the actual piece that you're creating on the CAD drawing. And that they're very much night and day. And arguably, even though you still fall in the same field based on its underlying principles and its governing phenomena, you're approaching the study in a much different manner. And so arguably, the computational effort would require much less money to do as a student, because arguably you would only need a computer and the correct software and the server and the bandwidth of the server and other associated costs with that, which are not cheap, but are not as hard to obtain necessarily as one would if going to an experimentally based degree path with no funding.
Yeah. So now you're working in a lab and you're in charge of doing all the supplying of materials in a way, correct?
Well, the onus for the supplying of the materials fell on me. So the person that agreed to serve as my new advisor in material science and engineering is also a very brilliant research professor who is now formally retired, by the name of Professor Michael E. Graham. And he's been very generous to me in my entire PhD path length, and on top of that, very patient. The only kind of stipulation that was made when I joined him was that because he's a research professor, and because of that he was on soft money, and soft money means that the research grants, the research projects in which he was investigating were only conducted if there was grant money to support that work. And so because he's not a full professor or tenure-track professor, he had no resources to provide me a salary. So again, you've got this Parag that's dealing with all of these research problems, but the more fundamental challenge that I had was making sure that Parag could eat dinner. Right? So there's always the research and the academic component of a progression, but what a lot of people put on the secondary consideration list, which I feel is not doing justice to the full experience of the graduate student path, is to recognize the part that affects the graduate student's life. And so I knew that taking this path, which was very generously provided to me, by the way, by Professor Graham and Dr. Irk at Argonne National Laboratory, was a challenge. All of this was a very big challenge to, establish the research that I wanted to do, but also find a way to fund the research that I was trying to do.
So I'm guessing you ran into trouble. You're saying you didn't have the funding for this. So what happened after that? Did you have to stop? Did you take a break?
Well, I took many breaks. Okay, so the fundamental point that I wanted to convey with this was that my cold approach to Argonne National Lab was successful because it's a government facility. And being a U.S. citizen and a PhD candidate at a very reputed institution, there are some certain allocations that are provided for people to do research at these types of government installations. And so my approach to them was, can I come use your equipment without any user's fees? And they said, yeah, that's fine, but we can't pay you anything. And Professor Graham said, yeah, I have the instruments that you need access to in order to create what it is that you're trying to create, that you're eventually going to test at Argonne National Laboratory. And you can have free reign over that equipment, but I can't pay you anything, right? So you've got this setup where I have a path to continue on research, but you've got a Parag that's already beaten down because of his own fabricated misery. To his own naivety, the fact that he didn't know how to handle taking a no and turning that into something positive. And even though he kept at the kind of global endeavor, you're talking about a person that was very mentally broken.
It
right?
sounds like a good point for the maturing of Parag. Right
yeah,
now,
but the thing is that now we're in year 3.5, year 4. So this is 2006, and I just qualified based on a project that I had developed from first principles and literature review, and that was all good. But again, the maturation process actually didn't happen instantly. It's not a very quantifiable thing, and neither can one look back and say, this is the time in which I had big realizations. I can guarantee you that I've struggled with some of this behavior pattern, these thoughts that I'm talking to you about right now, even as recently as a couple of months ago. When things don't go correctly, you have you change the way you view things, and that can be detrimental. So in answering your question about what actually happened at that point, it's a bit complicated. I thought that and this is the dumbest thing I think in the history of the world that's ever been done by a graduate student, which was that after I had applied for many grants and gotten rejected from all of them, I thought that because the onus for my own funding, my own salary fell on me, that I would go out and play poker and use poker as a business tool to supplement or to create my own salary.
Well, I don't hear anything wrong with that.
I think it was very bad for me because it was not easy for me to discretize that activity from what it was that I needed to do in the lab, right? So I at times became overwhelmed with that activity, and then there's a certain amount of escape into that activity as well, because it's very easy to go down and sit at a poker table somewhere and play cards, right? That in essence is also a fun activity if you're winning.
Yes. I was going to say.
So this entire endeavor, there were ups and downs. I'm not saying that there weren't good times. There were times that I thought I could actually make enough to supplement some of the research money that I needed as well. And of course, at the end of the day, I'm not here to make a judgment on whether or not this was necessarily right or wrong for someone else. But for me, this is a very, very, very bad idea to approach this. I could have done so much.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and recommend that people don't play poker throughout their grad school. I'll say that.
I'll tell you something else. I wasn't even bad at it. It's that I kept playing at a higher and higher level. And as you get higher and you have a bankroll mismanagement, what ends up happening is that you can't beat the variance anymore. And eventually it'll catch up with you. And so and you can't play with air, right? Nobody's in there playing with matchsticks. So if you go broke, as they call it in the business, it's very tough to restart. And many times when that had happened, or when I was close to it, that would additionally lead to a big negative aura around myself, and a very much of almost a
stress.
Shell of a person. Yeah, additional stress is putting it very lightly.
Yeah, well.
I felt like a shell of a person, and I disconnected from many of the people that I should not have disconnected from. And very luckily, the university of course, they didn't know about any of this at the time because I'm sure they would have tried to help me in another way. And they did. Occasionally, I had some teaching appointments and whatnot. But if they had known the full scope of what it was that I was doing, I think that they would have been very disappointed to know that one of their students was struggling in such a manner.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really important to be able to ask for help, just in general.
Very, very, very important. And I feel that in graduate school, the graduate students feel especially isolated because they feel that many of the programs that are at universities in terms of student affairs are established to cater to the undergraduate populace. And a lot of times that makes sense because the undergraduate populace is the one that encounters big hurdles in terms of alcohol abuse, for example, or bigger problems relating to grades, their performance in school as a function of their grades. In graduate school, it's kind of well known to be an established stressor, right? So many times graduate students feel that if they're going through stress, or if they feel depressed, or if they feel down on their luck or whatever, and this happens everywhere. It happens at Western Pacific State University of the Midwest, whatever. And it happens at Harvard. It's completely
even more broadly, it happens in any occupation, any type of career path. It's not just grad school, but it's the fact that maybe we're in grad school and we know that, you should be growing up, in air quotes, growing up between age 18 and 22. And then you're like, oh, I should be mostly ready.
Right.
But no,
and
it's a whole maturing process throughout adulthood, and people don't really take that.
There's also one of the other things is that a lot of times graduate student bodies are not very cohesive. You might be very close with the people that matriculated in the year as you did in your department, right?
Yeah, that's very true.
But what happens when some of those people end up graduating out or dropping out or leaving or just finishing with a master's and going or getting jobs? I mean, there's a lot that happens in one's life in one's 20s, right? There's a lot of relationships, not just within academia, but also in terms of your own personal life that you're balancing. You're kind of, there's a general sense of depression that attacks many people at that age that are in graduate school because they compare themselves with the other guys that they went to college with that were average students that are now buying BMWs, right? It's very, it makes you really question what it is that you're trying to do by getting these 3 letters.
So on this theme of asking for help, how did you turn this around? I mean, you said it wasn't a clear one point where, Parag matured a little bit or anything like that, but there must have been something you had to do.
Well, believe it or not,
a series of things, probably.
Yeah, sure. Believe it or not, the first person that I'm sure this is believable. The first person that I really opened up to about this is my father. And I had to because I was in a financial catastrophe. And he was very disappointed in me. And he came to Evanston. Evanston is where Northwestern University is located. And we had a very long conversation with how I should reestablish myself and kind of move back into the mode of PhD thinking and progression. And this, it had been on and off for 2 years from 2006 to 2008 where I kind of, disappeared off the face of the planet. I didn't really. I was still in communication to some extent. I was still holding a teaching appointment here and there. And, I was making do. But what ended up happening was that he helped me realize that some of these things were necessary. And believe it or not, I was able to reconstruct and pick up where I left off more or less around that time in 2008. So this is my 6th year of graduate school. But things were going fine. I would have periods of really good work. But then a lot was complicated by experimental breakdown and funding complications in general. And then another catastrophe occurred, which is when I had a very serious back injury. I had a very serious grouping of herniated discs.
Ouch.
That led to what is known as pressing of the slip disc on the sciatic nerve. And the sciatic nerve is the main nerve. You're a biologist, you know all.
I've seen a sciatic nerve, so.
Yeah, and I literally couldn't walk for 15 months to 18 months. So I had to cease my bench work, and I had another teaching appointment at the time, which the university was very generous in allowing me to keep. And they said, as long as you can make it across the street to tech and teach, why don't you just make sure that you're healthy? My advisor said, I agree with this, more or less. I mean, obviously the conversations were very, very complicated and long in nature, but on the surface, there were so many other things that just kept propping up that I felt like I couldn't get a break. And so going back to your original question in this part of the segment about what did I do to really ask for help, I probably didn't do any real actual requests for help until my back problem became so significant that I was getting
until you physically needed help, right?
Yeah, until I physically needed help. Not only from, I'll give you an example. There are tenured professors and other students that oftentimes travel from Northwestern University to Argonne National Lab and back and forth. It's about a 45-mile trip one way, but the university, through its Office of Research, has provided for a car that goes between those two campuses. So I was still trying to push through by going to Argonne occasionally during those times of this very significant back injury, to the point where I asked professors to come and pick me up at my apartment so that I could hobble outside and sit in the car, basically keeled over in pain all day, and travel to Argonne so I could at least do a few investigations every once in a while. And sometimes I would take that entire trip, go down there and do nothing because I was in such pain all the time. But I had to lie on the floor. Nobody's ever heard this before. But I had to lie on the floor of the lab, not the lab, but where my office was, underneath the desk so people wouldn't see that I was. And it was very embarrassing. But I felt like I had no basis for which to ask for help. I felt that I had done so poorly. And now you're talking about year 8, year 9, year 10. That you feel like you're living the same year in repeat, and it's just this very mentally draining, completely debilitating experience that's happening to a person that feels like he should be the exact type of person that doesn't face that. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, and just like the physicality of this with your injury really.
But
it's really sticking in my mind. But it's
no question that I would not. The PhD at a certain point became less about getting the degree to show people what I had done and proving to everyone that I am passionate. I have the passion and the motivation to do this, come what may. If I continue with it with no funding, and that's the hand that I've been dealt, which is very apropos given my poker background, then that is the way that I have to play the hand. If I've been dealt a bad back, then that's the hand that I have to bluff with. I cannot let that overcome my ability to play the game. As long as I have a chip in a chair, I'm okay. And as long as nobody takes away that last chip, which nobody has ever wanted to do, they've always let me ante up and somehow win that pot. So I never needed to really beg to stay. I had to advocate very strongly. But the university has provided more measures for support than I would deem could ever be provided by an institution of higher education. And only after I realized that I should go and ask for help. And some of the main offices that I approached were the Office for Risk Management. My medical bills were out of control. I couldn't even afford insurance. I was given an allocation for some of that. Not everything, but enough so I could get by. My parents are certainly in the picture. They were helping out. And the Dean of Students Office, the Dean of Student Affairs, I didn't know how comprehensive these offices are. The Dean of the Graduate School.
You just get emails from them and you're like, whatever.
You would delete them immediately, right? There's a dean for student affairs for graduate students within the School of Engineering. I mean, it's that layered, right? And then most importantly, the Office for Student Disabilities. This is a location that I felt would not be somewhere that I would ever step foot. Another office was, and this is it can be potentially very embarrassing to say, but the counseling and psychological services, which I think is very underrated, but I have no problem telling people that because I think that there's a lot of value in getting over whatever stigma someone might have and moving to that stage where if you're not asking for help, you're never gonna get better. But if you ask for help, if you admit that you might need, if there's something that you might not know about yourself, or that you might benefit from that, and you're open-minded enough to kind of give it a shot, then you may be surprised at what comes out of that result.
Yeah. Cheers to that, man. No, because I also have a very close friend who actually she wants to be on the show, I think, to talk about her experiences with our health services and in particular the mental health services.
Sure.
And I've seen how important it can be to people, and I wish people, other graduate students would be open to using these services because these officers want to talk to you. They do.
They actually want to know what it is that's going on with their graduate students. If they don't have a mechanism for feedback, if all they're dealing with in terms of their interaction with a large part of the population has to do with alcohol and drug abuse or sexual attention and kind of that type of affair, a sexual discrimination or some sort of sexual assault, which is a large part of what they do, and it's magnificent. But the kind of mental hurdles that the graduate student might be facing as opposed to what another type of student might be facing, even a profession. So what I was saying about the mental health stigma is that a lot of graduate students prevent themselves from going because they don't feel as if that would apply to what it is that they're seeking. One of the best things that I learned out of these offices was how to structure what was lacking in my path. And this had very little to do with what one would consider to be pure mental health. There were resources to help people that get stagnated in these types of higher level thought processes or the circular logic that tends to plague them.
Man, okay. So I think that was a great turnaround, a great talk about how the types of resources you enable. You used your father, well, not use. Your father helped you, and I'm sure he gave you some good words of, and maybe a light butt kicking.
Right,
other than that,
which I needed.
Yeah.
How about many of those? Many such.
A sprinkling of rear end kicks.
Right.
Sure.
That.
But you also appeal to the resources available to you at your university, which is also important, and I hope everyone listening is able to appeal to their similar resources if they need it. And if they think they need it, maybe they should just contact and talk to the officer because they want to help.
I 100% agree with you, and it doesn't take very long, honestly, to pick up the phone and just call somebody at the university. I'm not talking about a crisis helpline. Of course, those are there if they're needed as well, but I'm talking about just maybe even walking in. They have walk-in appointments at places like this. And just being like, you know what? Can I come talk to somebody and just tell you my story? And sometimes even just telling somebody your story and realizing or hearing back from that person, if they have a PhD, they might tell you something about themselves. Or that person may give you insight as to how other people tackled their own challenges that they've heard. Certainly in a confidential manner, but, one of the things that I was surprised to hear was the statistic of how many graduate students actually utilize the service. And
what's that?
And that was at Northwestern, it was between 10 and 12% when I had asked this question. And at that point, I was surprised that it was so high But now, upon reflection, I am surprised that it's so low.
Yeah.
You know, I think everybody should have a mandated appointment with the Mental Health Services Office at some point before they do their PhD qualifier. Not to ascertain whether or not they're sane, because at some point we're all kind of crazy if we're doing a PhD.
Well, yeah, we're here. Exactly.
But whether or not they have some concerns, and you know, an ounce of prevention, it really can save you so much of a disaster in the long run. And a lot of times that's due to research, right? You tell your advisor, oh, I have this idea for the scope. And he's like, okay, don't be an idiot. Just do this one, this part of it, and the last part of it. And then tell me if you see any differences. If you do, you can do the full scope. But there's no need to do every single investigation without knowing what it is that you're searching for. And that's a very good kind of analogy to what I was doing. I wanted to do everything.
And I also want to say, it's not just, you don't only have to look to officially trained people. You can tell your friends, you know, or even your relatives, anyone who might be lending an ear, who you think would be willing to help you or have a helpful frame of mind. I
think you should just recommend people call Jason or Parag and be like, all right, we'll tell you all about it. No, right. but you're 100% right. I mean, that person need not be getting a PhD or have a PhD or even be present in academia, because a lot of the things that we're mentioning here today, quite in fact, have nothing to do with the PhD path. Specifically, they're all challenges that we all face as human beings.
Exactly. And
mine happens to be in the course of getting a PhD. But I guarantee you there's lots of other people out there that have certain 13-year challenges that they still have not been able to overcome. And on top of that, this is something that's such in the broad scheme of things, can be considered to be such a secondary problem, because I don't have real actual problems. I don't have a very large health concern. Well, I do, but it wasn't something that was going to take my life, right?
Yeah, it's not like having to search for water every day or anything. It's
right.
It's this.
You know, and I had a very difficult research path, but it's not as if the university was saying we're providing all of these roadblocks for you on purpose. You know, nobody ever said we don't want you here, Parag, or we don't want you to get this degree. Every single person I've ever spoken to at Northwestern University has been on my side. And that's what I necessarily did not get. Nobody wants to see a student fail. And I didn't realize that I needed to ask the questions and do the work to make myself be in a position where I could help myself, right?
Yeah.
So separating those problems from what are actually inconveniences, but just fabricated inconveniences, was very, very important. And I talk about this in my TED Talk a little bit, because it's almost one of the best pieces of prose I've ever read, written by Robert Fulghum in a part of his book called Uh-Oh, where he tells the story about being upset at the fact that he was served the same food for several days in a row. And he makes this complaint to a survivor of the Holocaust. And the person hears him out, and then he says, you know what your problem is? It's that you can't separate your problems from your inconveniences. Because this particular one is something that almost all of the people or some of the people in my past would have been pleased to have. You're just complaining about whether or not you like the food and what it is. But imagine not having any. And so he said, you know, one needs to separate the fact that a lump in the throat, a lump in the chest, and a lump in the oatmeal are not the same lump. And you have to learn how to tell the difference. And after reading this essay, which was given to me by the McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence, Professor San Bin Nguyen, here at Northwestern, I really had kind of one of the biggest, if you want to call anything an epiphany, it would be this. And I'm so grateful that he told me about this essay before I had given my TED Talk, because I actually speak to that point in it.
Huh. And actually, I have a similar story, not so much a story, but a similar time in which I had that epiphany of of choice, really. You know,
Sure.
you're always getting, and I forget the name of the book right now, so I'm not going to mention. But it's a really big point in Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People,
Yeah,
which you might know well.
of course.
It sounds like you do.
Well,
And I think it's one of the best.
I haven't read it, but I've read excerpts.
Uh-huh.
One of the better books that I read, which I feel is very inappropriately titled, which is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. But the fundamental premise behind that book, I think, is very misunderstood, because I think it comes off as if he's trying to instruct people to live falsely or with a false impression in order to falsely obtain the adoration of other people. And I think if you dig deeper into what the author's message is that you should have a revitalization of the way in which you approach your life path. And if you do that, and if you are genuine in such a approach, then that itself will shine through and is debatably more important than anything you might learn in the classroom.
And so I think your revitalization has ended with you where you are now, right? You're getting ready to finish your PhD.
Sure.
Writing up.
Well, let's just say this. I've always been kind of a soft-natured person. I'm a very happy-go-lucky guy. And even though these types of things were very negative, at the end of the day, I was still optimistic. Maybe even optimistic to the point of surprising people. Because when I tell people my story, most of them end up by saying, yeah, man, but why did you just quit? And it's because I have this real intense drive to do justice to the science. And at the end of the day, what I've learned is that is what I was always supposed to have been doing in the first place. I was just asked to learn and contribute to the science. And if that job is not done, then first of all, I have no right to complain about the amount of time that I've been here, or the quality of the work, or to be miserable about anything. So long as I have my health and my optimism, I'm a good kid.
There you go. That's a great line.
So may I...
philosophy, really. So let's...
I would like to, before we end, just say a few things. And so in true Reddit fashion, which is where we first communicated, the online website, I'd like to do a too long didn't listen, which is a short form TLDL, which kind of summarizes the 6 major points that we talked about.
I hope they listen, though, because they're not going to listen to this. Otherwise.
I hope they do listen. Well, the first is that one should never be scared to ask for help. And if you don't find it in localized departments, go to the institutional level and don't feel scared to do that. The second is to redefine your problems and change your viewpoint from those that are truly problems to those that are inconveniences. In this regard, I would recommend playing life like a video game. When you go into an airport and you go through security, that TSA agent is like a mini boss. You can play a mental game with yourself and try and figure out how it is that you're going to navigate around this mini boss instead of letting
jumping over his head, because that's
exactly. Well, don't do that. But in this type of activity, instead of being downtrodden about having to face it, use it as a mini challenge. Use it as something to educate yourself and to help alleviate what may be going on in somebody else's mind standing right next to you. Maybe one of the ways you can do that is by making small talk with them, or playing with the kid, or something. I mean, I'm just throwing out stuff here. The third is something that we mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, which is that I did a lot of thinking without acting, and as well a lot of acting without thinking. And that definitely needs, both of these are catastrophically bad, and they both need to be revised in one's path before investigating any subject, and not just research. The fourth is to live in today. There was a large portion of my life where I lived in yesterday, where I lived out of the CV and the accomplishments of yesteryear, and that would be okay for a very small period of time until people realize that you're not living with that sense of diligence, with that dedication to the science anymore. And you're just expecting people to recognize what it was that you did in the past and translate that to the future. And that was a very, very tough lesson to learn. Take all of the no's that you learn, that you're given, that you may not have ever gotten before, and translate that into a better experience, into a better way of looking at life. Okay, and then I've got one more little plug. So the plug is that as of this coming Thursday, early August 2014, I will be resuming or taking the post of the Vice President of Operations for the NASA Academy Alumni Association. And the reason I'm saying this is because this position is in charge of, in part, some of the application review or all of the application review for incoming young students that are interested in doing this internship, the NASA Academy. It's one of the best internships in the country. I'm an alumni of it, and I highly recommend this for all young scholars in any field of science because it's done at every NASA installation, or a great significant many of them in the country.
And this is aimed towards grad students or university?
It's aimed for seniors, juniors and seniors and sophomores, I think, in college. Okay. But they do take first-year graduate students, and it's available for the NASA Academy and other associated co-op positions and internships given by NASA are everywhere. And so those students that might be listening to this podcast at an earlier part of their graduate student career may find some value in that. But maybe just people out there in the general community, might be an aunt or have a niece or a nephew or somebody that's of the college age that may not necessarily know about this type of opportunity. And it's especially good because they try and target from a diverse area of people, and it has a lot of value. So just
That's awesome.
two more
that.
very quick things,
Please.
Right? Is that I feel, and I think I've touched upon this very quickly, is that what we've discussed today is in relation to my PhD, but a lot of what is generally happening, or a lot of what we've discussed, can be applied to any path in life. It's just a matter of the way that you approach it. And I'll leave you with one statement that has really meant the absolute world to me for someone who has been one of the most influential people in my life, and that's my current advisor, Professor Michael E. Graham in material science. And during one of my really down times, I said, Professor, I just don't really, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. And he told me, he said very, very succinctly, he said, you know what, Parag, I don't know if this PhD is for you. That's something that you're going to have to decide for yourself. And I know you're in your 11th year, but you deserve to be happy. What he told me was not that I should be happy or that I can be happy. He told me that I deserved to be happy. And I don't think that he would even remember this conversation if I played it back to him right now. But that one statement, in its simplicity, has meant the world to me. And I hope that all the young scholars out there do exactly that and realize that regardless of where they are in their careers, they deserve to be happy.
Thanks to Parag for the great story and outlook. If you have a similar story, we'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment at phdinprogress.com/14 or email us at feedback@phdinprogress.com. We're also active on Twitter, so say hi. We're at PhD Podcast. Finally, if you'd really like to help out the show, leave an honest rating and review in the iTunes Store. This boosts our visibility and gets the show out to other prospective listeners. As always, all this information and more can be found at phdinprogress.com.
This is the dumbest thing, I think, in the history of the world that's ever been done by a graduate student.